The metal screech of the tow truck's winch tore through the early morning silence. District Attorney Maya Vance stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching in disbelief as her pristine Audi was dragged sideways, the rims grinding against the unforgiving curb. Officer Brad Miller didn't rush. He stood by his cruiser, leisurely wiping a smear of jelly from his donut off his thumb, his eyes glinting with a toxic, calculated cruelty. As Maya stepped forward, Miller stepped into her path, looming over her with a smirk that felt like a slap in the face. "This isn't your neighborhood, sweetheart," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "A black woman like you belongs on the bus, not in a luxury sedan reserved for real county officials." He leaned in closer, his stale breath hitting her face as he added, "Did you really think that fancy law degree would make people forget who you are? In this town, you're just a quota we had to fill, nothing more." Maya's hands trembled not from fear, but from a burning, blinding rage. Miller laughed, tossing his half-eaten donut onto the hood of her mangled car. "Don't bother calling your office," he sneered, turning his back on her. "No one's coming to help a diversity hire who can't even follow basic parking rules. Maybe if you spent less time playing dress-up and more time learning your place, you wouldn't be crying on the sidewalk. What happens next will destroy a legacy and rewrite history. Don't miss this story. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? If you want to see justice served, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned." Oakhaven County was a place of fractured echoes. It was a region physically divided by the sprawling concrete veins of Interstate 49 separating the affluent manicured north side from the neglected crumbling streets of the south side. For decades, this geographic divide had been mirrored by a social chasm that the political elite of Oakhaven seemed perfectly content to ignore. But that all changed 18 months ago with the election of Maya Vance. Maya was not a product of the establishment. At 39, she was the first black woman to hold the office of district attorney in the county's 200-year history. Her platform had been simple, yet radical: accountability for all. She had spent her career in the trenches of public defense, witnessing how the law acted as a shield for the powerful and a sword against the vulnerable. Her election had sent a localized earthquake through the Oakhaven political establishment, rattling the foundations of a system that had operated on cronyism and quiet corruption for as long as anyone could remember. In the mahogany-paneled offices of the downtown courthouse, Maya was a force of nature. She was impeccably tailored, razor-sharp, and possessed a work ethic that bordered on the obsessive. Her staff, a diverse mix of idealistic young lawyers and battle-hardened investigators, revered her. But for every person who saw her as a beacon of hope, there was a relic of the old guard who saw her as an existential threat. Nowhere was this hatred more visceral than in the Oak Ridge Police Department, just 3 blocks away. Officer Brad Miller was the embodiment of that resistance. A 20-year veteran of the force, Miller was a thick-necked, heavy-handed patrolman who viewed the streets as his personal dominion. To Miller, the law was not a set of statues. It was a weapon to be wielded against anyone who challenged the status quo. He had spent his career operating under a gentleman's agreement with his supervisors. If he kept the South Side quiet and the complaints suppressed, no questions would be asked. But Maya Vance had shattered that agreement. Her first month in office, she had instituted mandatory unannounced body camera audits. She had launched an independent task force to review cold cases involving police brutality. She had refused to sign off on plea deals that smelled of coerced confessions. To men like Miller, Maya wasn't just doing her job. She was an intruder, a diversity hire, who had the audacity to suggest that the people wearing the badge should answer to the people they were meant to serve. The tension had been simmering for months. Miller and his inner circle, a group of officers who called themselves the Blue Line Brigade, had spent countless hours in the precinct break room, their conversations thick with resentment. They mocked her clothes, they scrutinized her travel, and they constantly whispered about how the natural order of Oakhaven had been subverted. She thinks she's a queen, Miller would sneer, leaning back in his chair with a cup of burnt coffee in his hand. But queens get toppled. All it takes is one little slip, one little mistake, and the whole house of cards comes down. Maya knew she was being watched. She knew the files on her desk were being monitored. She knew that every time she pushed for a reform, a wall of silence went up around her. Yet she remained unfazed. She understood that progress was rarely a smooth upward trajectory. It was a messy, confrontational crawl through the mud. On this particular Tuesday, Maya was preparing for the most critical case of her tenure, the prosecution of the Iron Spikes, a local gang with deep clandestine ties to high-ranking city officials. The trial was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. It was the case that would prove whether or not Oakhaven was truly ready to be cleaned up. Maya had spent the entire night at the office, her mind a whirlwind of depositions, witness statements, and legal strategy. By 6 a.m., she was exhausted, her eyes burning from the glow of her dual-monitor setup. She grabbed her briefcase, smoothed her blazer, and headed out to the municipal parking lot, unaware that Miller had been tracking her routine for weeks. He had been waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect place, and the perfect excuse. He didn't just want to bother her. He wanted to break her composure right before the biggest moment of her career. He wanted to show her that no matter how many laws she wrote or how many reforms she signed out on the street, the law was whatever he said it was. As Maya walked toward her car, she didn't sense the cruiser idling in the alleyway. She didn't see the malicious grin spreading across Miller's face as he reached for his radio. She only saw the morning sun hitting the windshield of her Audi, a brief moment of quiet before the storm. The morning air in Oakhaven was thick, stagnant, and already pressing down with the weight of an impending heat wave. It was exactly 8:15 a.m. 45 minutes before Maya Vance was expected to stand before the grand jury to dismantle the Iron Spikes syndicate. She turned the corner of the municipal lot, her heels clicking sharply against the cracked pavement. Her mind was already in the courtroom rehearsing the opening statement that would blow the lid off the city's deepest political rot. She reached for her key fob, but her hand stopped mid-air. Her heart skipped a beat, then plummeted into her stomach. Her midnight blue Audi A6 was not where she had left it. Instead, it was pushed against a jagged concrete island. The driver's side door crumpled inward, where a heavy reinforced steel bumper had clearly made contact. A flatbed tow truck from Blue Line Towing was idling nearby, its hydraulic whine cutting through the morning stillness. Standing by the driver's side of the car, with a smirk that felt like a surgical incision, was Officer Brad Miller. Maya didn't run. She didn't shout. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her icy cold, but her training kicked in. She reached for her phone to record, but Miller was faster. With a predatory grace, he moved from behind the car, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Don't even think about it, D.A.," Miller said, his voice smooth, devoid of any professional courtesy. "You're impeding an emergency egress. You parked in a fire zone and you're causing a public safety hazard." Maya looked at the ground. The fire zone was a patch of faded yellow paint on a curb that hadn't seen a fire truck since the Reagan administration. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "That isn't a fire lane, and my car is clearly within the designated municipal boundary. You know exactly whose car this is. This is professional misconduct, and it's a direct interference with my duties as a district attorney." Miller let out a short, bark-like laugh. He walked slowly around her, effectively cutting her off from the vehicle. Then he did something that made Maya's skin crawl. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a glazed donut, and took a deliberate, slow bite. As he chewed, he leaned toward her, intentionally invading her personal space. My. He drawled, the sugary glaze glistening on his lip. "You really do have a sense of entitlement, don't you?" A black woman like you belongs on the bus, not in a luxury sedan reserved for real county officials." He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Did you really think that fancy law degree would make people forget who you are? In this town, you're just a quota we had to fill, nothing more." Maya felt her pulse thundering in her ears. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, refusing to let him see the fear that was beginning to blossom in her chest. Miller didn't stop there. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the remainder of his donut, sticky white frosting, and all directly onto the hood of the pristine Audi. "Don't bother calling your office," he sneered, turning his back on her to signal the tow truck operator. "No one's coming to help a diversity hire who can't even follow basic parking rules. Maybe if you spent less time playing dress-up and more time learning your place, you wouldn't be crying on the sidewalk." He gestured to the driver. The chains rattled, the winch groaned, and the car was hoisted up with a violent jolt. The sound of metal grinding against metal was like a screech of laughter. Miller watched the car disappear around the corner, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Good luck in court, DA," he called out over his shoulder, his voice echoing in the empty lot. "You're going to need a miracle to make it there on time." Maya stood alone in the heat, the smell of burnt rubber and exhaust lingering in the air. She looked at the spot where her car had been, then down at her own reflection in a puddle of oil. She was bruised, she was being mocked, and she was seconds away from being late for the most important case of her life. She realized then that this wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was a message. They were trying to break her, to humiliate her, and to show the entire city that even the top law enforcement official in the county could be discarded like trash if she didn't know her place. But as she pulled out her phone and saw the notification of a missed call from her chief investigator, Maya's expression shifted. The panic faded, replaced by something much colder, much more dangerous. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had just realized exactly how far the enemy was willing to go, and exactly how she was going to burn that enemy to the ground. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the mayor. She dialed a number that wasn't in her official contact list. "It started," she said into the phone, her voice barely a whisper. "Get the files, all of them." Maya walked into the courthouse annex 5 minutes late. Her pulse had finally settled into a rhythmic, icy determination. She moved past the security checkpoint, her eyes fixed forward. The air inside the building felt heavy, charged with the whispers of bailiffs and court clerks who had already heard the rumors the district attorney had been humiliated on Elm Street. She stepped into the elevator, but before the doors could close, Officer Miller, who had clearly looped back to the courthouse, shoved his hand in to hold them open. He stepped in the smell of stale coffee and grease clinging to his uniform. The elevator was cramped, claustrophobic. "Rough morning, counselor?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with a mock concern that made Maya's stomach turn. Maya remained silent, staring at the floor numbers as they ticked upward. She could feel Miller's eyes on her, tracing her every movement with predatory curiosity. "You know," Miller continued, leaning against the back wall, "when I saw you trying to record me earlier, I had to be proactive. It's a dangerous world out there. We can't have people misinterpreting police action." He pulled a sleek, expensive-looking phone out of his pocket and tapped the screen. Maya's heart froze. It was her own smartphone, the one she had left on the passenger seat of her car. "I found this lying on the street," Miller said, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Such a shame. It seems to have had a technical glitch. I tried to unlock it to find the owner, but... Oops." He tilted the screen toward her. It was blank. The factory reset screen glowed in the dim light of the elevator. "All your photos, your contacts, your precious little recordings of your reforms, gone. Just like that." Maya's jaw tightened, a muscle in her cheek pulsing with suppressed rage. "You know that's a federal offense, Miller. Tampering with evidence, theft, obstruction of justice. You're not just breaking the law, you're digging a grave." Miller let out a low, guttural laugh. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Evidence who's going to testify, the tow truck driver. The guys in the precinct, we're a family here, Maya, and we protect our own. You're just a guest who's overstayed her welcome." The elevator dinged at the third floor. Miller stepped out, but stopped, turning back with one final sharp barb. "Don't bother looking for the car. It's in a private lot out on the edge of the county. The storage fees are accruing by the hour. By the time you get it back, the bill will probably cost more than your entire wardrobe." As the door slid shut, Maya finally let out a ragged breath. Her phone was gone. The evidence of his illegal tow, his verbal abuse, his overt racism, it had been wiped clean in seconds. She was alone, isolated, and under the watchful gaze of a force that seemed determined to break her spirit. She didn't go to her office. She went straight to the secure evidence room, bypassed the main desk, and went to the back office of her chief investigator, Elias Thorne. Elias looked up, his expression hardening when he saw the state of her. "Maya, what happened? I heard a report that your vehicle was impounded." "It was stolen, Elias. By Miller. He took my phone, he wiped my data, and he's laughing about it in the hallway." Maya said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. She walked over to his desk and slammed her palms down. "I don't want a complaint filed. Complaints get buried in a filing cabinet in the chief's office. I want war. I want you to pull every single dispatch log, every tow authorization, and every citizen complaint associated with Miller and his Blue Line crew for the last 10 years. I want to know who is signing off on his paperwork, who is paying his bonuses, and where the money from these impoundments is really going." Elias sat back, his eyes widening. "Maya, if we do this, we're essentially declaring war on the entire department. Chief Holloway will shut us down before we even get to the first box of files." "Let him try," Maya said, her eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting light. "I don't need the department. I need the truth. And I'm going to find it even if I have to tear this entire city down to the foundation to expose the rot." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "And Elias, get me a secure terminal. Something not connected to the city's main grid. We're moving off the books." As she walked out, the gravity of what she had set in motion hit her. She had no phone, no car, and a precinct full of men who wanted to see her destroyed. But for the first time in months, she felt a strange, chilling sense of clarity. Miller thought he had won the battle on the street, but he had no idea that he had just forced her into the only arena where he couldn't hide the law. The air in the district attorney's office was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the oppressive hum of fluorescent lights. It was late past midnight, but Maya Vance was still at her desk. She had moved her operations to a small, isolated room in the basement of the courthouse, far away from the prying eyes of the clerks and the security cameras that she now suspected were being monitored by the police department. The next morning, the Blue Line Brigade didn't let up. Maya walked into the main lobby of the courthouse and was met by Chief Holloway. He was a man who wore his badge like a suit of armor, his expression unreadable. He stood with his arms crossed, blocking the path to her office. "Ms. Vance," Holloway said, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "I've received reports of some friction between your office and my officers. I understand there was a parking dispute yesterday." Maya stopped, her eyes meeting his. "A parking dispute, Chief. Your officer vandalized my personal property, stole my communication device, and proceeded to harass me in the elevator of this courthouse. That's not a dispute. That's a crime." Holloway stepped closer, his voice dropping to a condescending, patronizing tone that made Maya's blood boil. "Maya, let's be realistic. We have high standards here in Oakhaven. We need people who can maintain order and respect the local customs of the precinct. Some people, perhaps those who are a bit too sensitive, simply aren't built for the grit required to keep these streets safe. You're trying to force a change that this city isn't ready for, and quite frankly, you're making it very difficult for my men to do their jobs." The room seemed to fall silent as other staff members slowed their pace, listening. Holloway continued, "If you continue to pursue these baseless grievances against Officer Miller, you're going to find yourself very isolated. The union is powerful, Maya, and they don't look kindly on people who try to dismantle the foundation of their livelihood." Maya didn't blink. She felt the eyes of every officer in the lobby on her, waiting for her to break. "Is that a threat, Chief?" Holloway merely smiled, a cold, empty expression. "It's a warning, Ms. Vance, from one public servant to another. Know your place or be prepared to lose it." He turned and walked away, leaving Maya standing in the center of the lobby. She felt the weight of the silence around her. The ostracization was total. That afternoon, when she entered the precinct to request a standard records transfer, the officers didn't even look up from their desks. They didn't offer the usual courtesy of holding a door. They didn't respond to her greetings. She was a ghost in her own city. Back in her basement office, Elias Thorne was waiting. He looked exhausted, his desk covered in stacks of yellowing paper. "I've been digging through the archives," Elias said, his voice tense. "The records are a mess. Miller has been involved in nearly 40 vehicle impoundments in the last year alone, and almost every single one of them was towed by Blue Line Towing. But here's the kicker, Maya. I can't find a single municipal contract for that company. They don't exist in the city's registry." Maya leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the documents. "They're running an off-the-books extraction ring. They use the badge to fabricate the violation, use their own private company to hold the cars, and then bleed the victims dry with storage fees. They aren't just harassing people, they're running a racketeering operation under the color of law. It's brilliant in a sick sort of way," Elias whispered. "And look at this." He slid a file over. "The address for Blue Line Towing leads to a vacant lot owned by a shell corporation, and that corporation is registered to the chief's own home address." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just Miller. This was the entire command structure. They weren't just protecting a bad cop. They were partners in a criminal enterprise. Maya sat back, the dim light of the basement casting long, jagged shadows against the wall. She knew the danger they were in. If they pushed this, they wouldn't just be fighting the police. They would be fighting the entire political establishment of Oakhaven. "They think they've silenced me," Maya said, her voice hard as flint. "They think taking my phone and breaking my car is enough to make me quit. They have no idea what's coming." She stood up and walked over to an old beige laptop that sat in the corner of the room. It was an ancient, refurbished machine, a relic from a forgotten era of computing. She pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, showing the blue and white interface of Windows 98. It was a joke of a machine, something that belonged in a museum, but it was the only device in the building, completely air-gapped from the city's compromised network. In exactly 2 seconds, the desktop appeared, and Maya began the process of decrypting the digital trail she had been building in secret. She was no longer looking for a parking ticket. She was building a case that would burn the entire precinct to the ground. The air in the cramped basement felt as though it were being sucked out by the very tension radiating from the two people inside. Maya Vance stood over the ancient beige laptop, its screen casting a sickly flickering cyan glow across her face. The Windows 98 interface, with its blocky icons and primitive aesthetic, looked hopelessly out of place in the year 2026. It was a technological dinosaur, a machine so old that it couldn't even connect to the modern infected network of the Oakhaven courthouse, let alone be tracked by the sophisticated spyware Chief Holloway likely had installed on every other device in the building. Elias Thorne paced the small room, his footsteps echoing on the concrete. I still don't understand how you managed to pull those encrypted logs from the central server, Maya. That terminal hasn't been updated since the turn of the century. If anyone saw you trying to run an exploit on it, they'd think you were just a Luddite trying to find a lost Word document. Maya didn't look up. Her fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic staccato clicking. That's exactly why it works, Elias. No one expects a threat to come from a machine that can barely open a PDF. They're so busy monitoring our official emails and the new cloud-based case management system that they've completely ignored the trash in the basement. She hit a final key, and a cascade of raw data began to scroll down the screen, a wall of text that represented the lifeblood of the Blue Line Brigade's operation. It was a digital map of human misery. Over the last 5 years, Miller and his associates had initiated over 2,000 impoundments. Every single one followed the same pattern: a fabricated violation, a call to Blue Line towing, and a subsequent release fee that often amounted to 3 times the value of the vehicle itself. Look at this. Maya pointed to a column of figures. The money isn't just going into the towing company's accounts. It's being funneled through a series of microtransactions to a retirement fund that only the chief and 3 of his senior captains have access to. It's a pension padding scheme built on the backs of the Southside residents. Elias stopped pacing. He leaned in his eyes, scanning the damning columns of digits. This is it, Maya. This is the structural evidence we need. But Miller, he's still out there, probably waiting for us to make a move. If he finds out we're down here, he won't just try to humiliate you again. He'll make sure you never walk out of this basement. Let him try, Maya said, her voice dropping to a steely, dangerous register. He's already played his hand. He thinks I'm a diversity hire who's afraid of a little bullying. He doesn't realize that by targeting me, he gave me the perfect excuse to launch an investigation into the entire department's internal affairs without even needing the chief's authorization. She pulled a compact, encrypted flash drive from her pocket. It was a high-speed, military-grade storage device that looked like a common USB stick. She plugged it into the archaic laptop. The machine groaned under the strain, the disk drive whirring like a dying bird, but the transfer was nearly instantaneous. I'm sending this to Harrison Pierce, Maya declared, naming one of the most ruthless civil rights attorneys in the country. He's been waiting for a case of this magnitude for a decade. He won't just sue the city. He'll dismantle their ability to function. And once Pierce files that class action suit, it won't be just a local matter anymore. It'll trigger a federal civil rights probe. The DOJ will be in Oakhaven within 48 hours. Elias looked at her, his expression a mix of awe and terror. You're going to scorched earth the entire administration, aren't you? I was elected to bring justice to this county, Maya replied finally, turning away from the glowing screen. If the only way to deliver that is by burning the old guard to the ground, then I'll be the one to hold the torch. Suddenly, the heavy iron door of the basement groaned. The sound of heavy rhythmic boots vibrated against the floorboards above. Someone was coming down the stairs, and they weren't trying to be quiet. Maya looked at Elias. The laptop was still whirring, the screen still displayed the incriminating financial data. Hide the drive, Maya whispered. Elias shoved the device into his pocket, just as the door handle turned. The silhouette of a man filled the doorway, not Miller, but Chief Halloway. He looked down at the ancient beige laptop with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. Playing with antiques, Ms. Vance? Halloway asked, his eyes darting around the small, windowless room. I was just looking for you. It seems there's been a, shall we say, clerical error in the district attorney's budget. It appears your department's access to the secure evidence room has been suspended pending an internal investigation. He stepped into the room, his eyes lingering on the laptop for a second too long. And I'd be careful down here, Maya. It's awfully easy to get lost in the basement of this building, and even easier for things to go missing, like people. Maya stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the man who wanted her gone was staring right at her. She realized then that the war had already begun and there was no going back. The tension in the basement was so thick, it felt like it could suffocate them. Chief Holloway stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing, his eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a predator. He stepped closer to the beige laptop, his hand brushing the dusty desk. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. If he touched that mouse, if he saw the raw data, she wouldn't make it out of the basement alive. "A clerical error, Chief?" Maya asked, her voice steady, despite the cold sweat prickling her skin. "That's an interesting way to describe an attempt to obstruct an active investigation into police racketeering." Holloway froze. He turned slowly, his face contorting into a mask of cold fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Maya. You think you're playing a game of law and order. You're playing a game of survival. And in Oakhaven, the law is whatever the man with the badge says it is." He walked toward the exit, pausing at the threshold. "Clean out your desk by morning, and consider yourself lucky if you aren't escorted out in handcuffs for theft of city property." As the heavy iron door slammed shut, Elias exhaled a ragged, shaky breath. "He's going to move against us tonight, Maya. If we don't file that lawsuit right now, we're dead in the water." Maya didn't wait. She grabbed the encrypted flash drive from Elias's trembling hand, walked to the far corner of the room, and pulled back a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a ruggedized satellite uplink device, a failsafe she had installed the day she took office. She didn't need the city's internet. She didn't need their permission. With a few keystrokes, she triggered the upload to Harrison Pierce's secure server. The progress bar crawled across the screen, 10%, 30%, 60%. "We need to leave," Elias urged, glancing at the security monitor. Two patrol cars were pulling into the rear lot, their lights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. It was Miller and his brigade. They weren't there for a clerical dispute. They were there to clean up the basement. Maya's hand hovered over the send button as the upload hit 99%. Then the monitor flickered. The power in the entire basement was cut, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. "They've killed the mains," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "They're coming down." The heavy thud of boots began to descend the stairs. Maya didn't panic. She had spent a decade defending people who had no one else to turn to. She knew exactly how the system tried to bury the truth, and she had built a bunker specifically for this moment. As the door was kicked off its hinges, a blinding beam of tactical light flooded the room, pinning Maya and Elias against the far wall. Officer Miller stood in the doorway, his service weapon drawn, his face twisted in a feral, triumphant grin. "End of the line, counselor," Miller sneered, stepping into the room. He didn't see the tiny blue LED blinking on the satellite device hidden behind the desk. He didn't see the progress bar on the laptop finally blink, "Upload complete." "You really should have learned your place," Miller added, raising his weapon. "This city doesn't want you. It never did." Maya stood tall, her eyes locking onto Miller's. For the first time, she didn't look like a DA. She looked like a judge. "You're right, Miller," she said, her voice echoing in the small space. "This city doesn't want people like you anymore. And the world is about to see exactly who you are." Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound that made Miller flinch, not a gunshot, but the piercing digital chime of a global notification alert emanating from his own radio. His colleagues outside were shouting, their voices distorted by static, but the words were clear. "Federal raid in progress. Route 9 impound lot. All units stand down. Repeat, all units stand down." Miller's face went pale. His gun wavered. "What did you do?" "I didn't just file a lawsuit, Miller," Maya said, a small cold smile touching her lips. I triggered a federal intervention, and they aren't here for me. They're here for the wreckage of your empire." The room fell silent as the heavy sound of a helicopter began to vibrate the foundation of the building. The hammer had dropped, and for the first time in Oakhaven history, the people holding the badges were the ones trembling in the dark. The basement, once a claustrophobic cage of shadow and secrets, was now bathed in the strobe light intensity of blue and red cruisers flooding the parking lot outside. Miller's hand, which had been locked around the grip of his sidearm, began to shake. The radio on his shoulder crackled with a frantic, unintelligible symphony of panic. The Blue Line Brigade wasn't just losing control, they were being systematically dismantled in real time. Maya didn't move. She watched Miller's world disintegrate. He looked toward the door, then back at her, his eyes wild with a sudden, paralyzing realization. He wasn't the hunter anymore. "You think this changes anything?" Miller spat, though his voice lacked the venomous edge it had possessed only minutes before. "The Union will fight this. Holloway will spin this. You're still just one woman in a basement with no car, no phone, and no career left." "You're wrong, Brad," Maya replied, her voice eerily calm. "I'm the woman who just turned the key in the lock, and you're the one who's about to be locked inside." At that moment, the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs didn't just open, it exploded inward. But it wasn't the local police. It was a tactical team of FBI agents, their gear marked with bold black lettering, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division. The agents swarmed the room with a clinical, terrifying efficiency that made Miller's own tactical training look like a high school drill. They didn't shout. They moved like ghosts. One agent leveled his rifle at Miller's chest, his voice a low, authoritative growl. "Drop the weapon, officer, on the ground now." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of defiance before the cold reality of a dozen laser sights dotting his chest forced his hand. He dropped his gun, the metal clattering against the concrete, with a sound of finality that seemed to vibrate through the entire building. As they slammed him against the wall and the handcuffs ratcheted around his wrists, the smug, invincible mask he had worn for 20 years finally shattered. He looked over his shoulder at Maya, his face pale, his eyes wide with a burgeoning, hollow terror. Outside, the scene was one of total systemic collapse. At the Route 9 impound lot, the federal agents were unearthing the Blue Line towing ledger, a meticulously kept handwritten record of every extortionate fee, every fake violation, and every kickback payment funneled into the chief's secret offshore accounts. In the main lobby of the courthouse, Chief Holloway was being escorted past his own officers. He looked smaller, frailer. His tailored suit jacket crumpled his badge, the symbol of his absolute authority dangling loosely from his belt, before being stripped away by a federal supervisor. The courtroom gallery, which had been packed with victims of the Southside extortion ring, erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was the raw, guttural sound of people who had lived in fear for decades, finally feeling the first breath of air. Maya walked out of the basement, stepping over the threshold that had been her prison for the last 48 hours. She stood in the center of the courthouse lobby, watching as the machines of justice, the real ones, began to grind the rot out of Oakhaven. She walked over to the evidence processing desk, where an FBI agent was logging a stack of files. She spotted the Blue Line towing ledger open on the table. It was all there, the names, the dates, the amounts. It was a roadmap of pure, unadulterated corruption. "Everything is here, Ms. Vance," the agent said, nodding respectfully. "The financial ties, the wiretaps, the coerced statements. We have enough to bury the entire command staff for the next 2 decades. Maya looked at the ledger, then toward the back of the room, where Miller was being dragged out to a federal transport van. He caught her eye one last time. He didn't sneer. He didn't boast. He just stared, looking like a man who had finally realized that he had spent his life building a castle on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. The room fell into a heavy, profound silence. The corruption that had defined Oakhaven for generations was no longer a secret, no longer a rumor, and no longer an internal matter. It was now a federal indictment. Maya hadn't just fought back. She had exposed the vulnerability of a system that believed it was untouchable. And as the flashbulbs of the waiting press corps began to strobe through the courthouse windows, she knew the hardest part was over. The truth was no longer buried. It was the only thing anyone in Oakhaven would be talking about for the rest of their lives. The criminal trial of the United States versus Bradley Miller and others was not a debate, it was an autopsy of a dying institution. The federal courthouse, usually a bastion of stiff, sterile decorum, felt like a pressure cooker. For 3 weeks, the gallery was filled with the very people Miller had terrorized, the single mothers who had lost their vehicles, the gig workers who had been forced to pay storage fees for phantom violations, and the elderly who had been intimidated into silence. The atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating. Every day, the prosecution laid out the rot. They didn't need theatrical speeches. They had the cold, hard, damning data. They played the audio from the hidden microphones planted in the precinct break room, the tapes where Miller and his brigade laughed about shaking down residents and explicitly referenced their quota for the month. When Miller's own voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, bragging about how he enjoyed the look on a black woman's face when she realized she couldn't afford to get her car back, the room fell silent. It was a silence so absolute, so heavy, that you could hear the frantic ticking of the courtroom clock. Miller, stripped of his uniform and draped in a drab, ill-fitting suit, looked like a shell of the man who had loomed over Maya in the parking lot. His arrogance had curdled into a twitchy, pathetic paranoia. He wouldn't look at the gallery. He wouldn't look at the judge. He kept his eyes fixed on the mahogany table, his hands trembling so violently that he had to clasp them together just to keep them still. The most devastating blow, however, came during the final week. Harrison Pierce, the civil rights attorney Maya had brought in, presented the class action settlement. The city of Oakhaven, facing a mountain of evidence that proved systemic, decades-long discrimination and criminal extortion, had no path forward. They capitulated. A $100 million settlement fund was established to compensate every victim Miller and his crew had targeted over the past 10 years. But the money was just the beginning. On the final day of sentencing, Judge Eleanor Vance, no relation to Maya, but a jurist of equal terrifying integrity, looked down from the bench. Miller stood before her, his head bowed. He looked 20 years older than he had when the ordeal began. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "You were entrusted with the most sacred of public duties to protect and serve. Instead, you used your position as a predator. You weaponized the law not to maintain order, but to extort the vulnerable and satisfy your own cruel sense of entitlement. You believed that your badge made you immune to the laws you were sworn to uphold." She adjusted her glasses, her eyes locking onto his. "You thought you were a king in your own little fiefdom. You were wrong. Today you are simply a man who has betrayed his oath, his community, and his own humanity." The sentence was 15 years in federal prison, consecutive, no parole. As the marshals approached to escort him away, Miller finally looked up. His gaze drifted across the courtroom, past the reporters, past the federal prosecutors, and landed directly on Maya Vance, who was seated in the front row, watching with a calm, steady gaze. There was no victory lap, no gloating. Maya didn't smile. She didn't offer a nod. She simply sat there, representing the immovable wall of justice that Miller had foolishly thought he could knock over. As the courtroom doors swung open for the last time, Miller was led out in chains. The reporters surged forward, the cameras flashed, but the sound that dominated the room was the heavy, rhythmic clatter of his shackles. He was no longer a symbol of power. He was a cautionary tale, a man who had traded his soul for a cheap sense of superiority and ended up with nothing but a concrete cell and a legacy of shame. When Maya walked out of the federal building that evening, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the streets of Oakhaven. The air felt different, cleaner somehow. For the first time, she walked through the municipal lot without looking over her shoulder. The fire lane was empty. The atmosphere of intimidation had been lifted, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a city finally beginning the long, hard process of healing. She opened her car door, sat in the driver's seat, and took a deep, steadying breath. She had done it. The precinct was buried, the rot was excised, and for the first time in Oakhaven's history, the law had actually worked for everyone. The aftermath of the Blue Line collapse was not a chaotic riot, but a profound structural rebirth. Oakhaven was no longer the city of divided realities. It was a municipality undergoing a long overdue catharsis. The $100 million settlement, the largest of its kind in the state's history, began to reach the hands of the people who had been systematically stripped of their dignity. Single mothers who had once walked miles to work because their cars were held hostage by Higgins's tow yard were now using their restitution to open businesses, pay off debts, and reclaim their autonomy. Chief Holloway's resignation was followed by an exodus of the old guard. The department was placed under a federal consent decree with an independent oversight board comprised of community leaders and civil rights advocates now holding the power to terminate any officer found in violation of ethical standards. The precinct was renamed, the uniforms were changed, and the culture of silence was replaced by a rigorous, transparent reporting system that made the Blue Line Brigade a relic of a darker era. Maya Vance, however, remained the steady anchor of this transition. She refused to use the victory for political maneuvering or celebrity status. Instead, she turned her focus to the structural inequalities that had allowed the extortion ring to thrive in the first place. She became a pioneer for systemic reform, often seen walking through the South Side neighborhoods, not as a politician guarded by a phalanx of police, but as a public servant listening to the people she had sworn to represent. In the federal prison in Pennsylvania, Brad Miller sat in a concrete cell, the reality of his 15-year sentence a crushing, eternal weight. He was stripped of the uniform that had been his only sense of identity. In the silence of his unit, he had nothing but his memories, the image of the Audi being dragged away, the feeling of the badge on his chest, and the final cold look Maya Vance had given him in the courtroom. He had tried to crush her to prove he was a king, and in doing so he had proven that he was nothing at all. As for Maya, she stood in the municipal lot on a crisp Tuesday in July 5 years later. The lot was pristine, the pavement marked with clear white lines, and the atmosphere was one of quiet progress. She walked to her car, opened the door, and looked at the rearview mirror. There was no cruiser shadowing her, no predator waiting to strike. She realized then that the fight for justice was not a single moment of triumph, but an endless, persistent commitment. She had learned that power, when untethered from empathy, becomes a disease. But when wielded with the cold, precise intent of the law, it becomes the most powerful tool for human dignity. She had faced the fire, and instead of being consumed by it, she had become the architect of a new foundation. The people of Oakhaven no longer viewed the courthouse as a place of judgment, but as a place of protection. And that more than any headline or settlement was the true measure of her victory. True power is never found in the badge you wear or the title you hold. It is found in the integrity you maintain when the world tries to force you to bow. No person is ever just a quota, and no system is so broken that it cannot be dismantled by a single voice that refuses to stay silent. Dignity is not a gift, it is an inherent right that no amount of arrogance can ever strip away. Well, what are your thoughts on Maya's journey? Do you believe justice truly prevails, or is it a battle we must fight every single day? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience and truth.